In the harsh desert of the Southwest Territory, where ancient traditions run deeper than mountain springs, a young Apache warrior named Aiyana faces an impossible choice that will forever change two worlds. For generations, her people have lived by a sacred code: honor above all else, duty before desire, tribe before self. But when Aiyana's heart calls to someone beyond the boundaries of her world, everything she has ever believed begins to crumble like wind-carved stone. This is not just another tale of forbidden love. This is the story of how one person's courage to follow their heart would challenge centuries of tradition and prove that true honor sometimes means breaking every rule you've ever known. When the moment of choice arrives, neither her tribe nor the outside world expects what happens next. What could possibly make someone risk everything they've ever known for love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, casting long shadows across the village where Aiyana had known every stone since childhood. The air carried the scent of sage and cedar smoke from the cooking fires, mingling with the earthy aroma of rain-dampened soil from the brief storm that had passed through before dawn. Aiyana's grandmother, Nish, sat cross-legged beside the entrance to their dwelling, her weathered hands moving with practiced grace as she sorted through the contents of an ancient medicine pouch. The leather bag, worn smooth by countless generations of fingers, held the accumulated wisdom of their people: dried herbs for healing, small stones that hummed with spiritual energy, and tiny carved bones that told stories older than memory. "Come, child," Nish called without looking up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen 8 decades pass like seasons. The morning light reveals what the darkness conceals. Aiyana approached, settling beside her grandmother with the fluid motion of someone trained from birth in the ways of stealth and grace. At 22 summers, she possessed the lean strength of a mountain cat and the keen eyes of an eagle, traits that had marked her as exceptional among her people. Yet this morning, something in her posture spoke of uncertainty, a subtle tension that her grandmother's experienced gaze immediately detected. "Your spirit walks 2 paths today," Nish observed, lifting a piece of sage to the light and examining its silver-green leaves. "This troubles you." The old woman's perception never ceased to amaze Aiyana. Since childhood, she had tried to hide her thoughts from Nish, only to discover that her grandmother saw through every attempt at concealment like sunlight through morning mist. "The world beyond our canyon grows closer each day," Aiyana said carefully. "Yesterday, I saw riders on the eastern ridge. Their horses left deep tracks in the soft earth near the water source." Nish nodded slowly, her fingers pausing in their work. "Change comes whether we welcome it or not, like winter follows autumn. The question is not whether it will arrive, but how we will meet it." Around them, the village stirred to life with familiar rhythms. Children's laughter echoed from the central area where they played with carved wooden animals, their carefree voices a sharp contrast to the weight of adult concerns. Women moved between the dwellings, tending to the endless tasks of daily survival, their conversations flowing in the musical cadences of their native tongue, mixed with the Spanish and English they had learned from necessity. The men had already departed for their various duties, some to hunt in the high country where deer still moved in ancient patterns, others to tend the horses that represented both freedom and survival to their people. The sound of their departure still lingered in the air, the soft whisper of moccasined feet and the quiet snort of well-trained mounts. "Your father left before sunrise," Nish mentioned, as if reading Aiyana's thoughts. "The council meeting at Red Rock Canyon requires his presence. There are decisions to be made about the new treaty negotiations." Aiyana's jaw tightened at the mention of treaties. Such documents had never brought anything but sorrow to her people, promises written on paper that seemed to dissolve like morning dew when circumstances changed. Her father Kyoto served as one of the tribal negotiators, a role that aged him visibly with each passing season. "He carries a heavy burden," Aiyana said. "As do you, granddaughter." Nish set down the medicine pouch and turned her full attention to Aiyana. "But some burdens are chosen, others are inherited, and still others are gifts disguised as challenges." The old woman's words carried layers of meaning, as they always did. Nalnish spoke in the traditional way, where wisdom came wrapped in riddles that revealed their truth only when the listener was ready to understand. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the morning stillness. Aiyana watched its graceful flight, envying the bird its freedom to soar above the boundaries that confined earthbound creatures. The hawk acknowledged no treaties, respected no borders drawn by human hands. It simply followed the wind currents where they led. "The sacred eagle feather your grandfather left you," Nalnish said quietly. "Have you considered its message lately?" Aiyana's hand moved instinctively to the small pouch at her waist where she kept the precious feather, passed down from her grandfather, who had been a great warrior and spiritual leader. The feather seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm, as if responding to her touch with memories of its former owner. Her grandfather, Ashki, had earned the right to wear eagle feathers through deeds of courage that still echoed in tribal stories told around winter fires. Each feather represented a moment when he had chosen honor over safety, duty over comfort. "He saw something in you that others have yet to recognize," Nalnish continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of ancient storytelling. "The day before he passed into the spirit world, he spoke of a vision, a young warrior who would face a choice that would define not just their own path, but the future of our people." Aiyana felt a chill despite the warming sun. Her grandfather's visions had always proven true, though their meaning often remained hidden until events unfolded to reveal their significance. She had carried the weight of his expectations since childhood, training harder than any of her peers, pushing herself beyond the limits that satisfied others. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Takoda, her childhood friend and now fellow warrior, emerged from behind a cluster of juniper trees. His face bore the distinctive markings of war paint, red ochre mixed with yellow clay in patterns that had been passed down through his family line for generations. The paint served both practical and spiritual purposes, protecting the skin from sun and wind, while invoking the strength of ancestral spirits. "The training ground awaits," he said, though his eyes held a question that went deeper than mere morning exercises. "Your father asked me to ensure you maintained your skills while he attends to council matters." Aiyana rose with fluid grace, but not before catching the meaningful look that passed between Takoda and her grandmother. There were undercurrents here, conversations that had taken place without her knowledge. The realization stirred something restless in her chest, a feeling she had been experiencing more frequently in recent weeks. "My skills need no maintaining," she replied, perhaps more sharply than necessary. "They grow stronger each day." Takoda's expression remained neutral, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He had known her long enough to recognize the edge in her voice, the sign that her legendary composure was fracturing around something deeper. They walked together toward the training area, a cleared space among the rocks where generations of warriors had honed their abilities. The ground bore the scars of countless practice sessions, divots from thrown spears, scorch marks from fire-building competitions, and smooth patches worn by dancing feet during ceremonial preparations. Other young warriors had already assembled, their faces painted with the colors that marked their family lineages and personal achievements. Each pattern told a story, recording victories in battle, successful hunts, or spiritual quests completed. The sight of so much accumulated tradition painted on living faces should have filled Aiyana with pride and belonging. Instead, she felt something she could barely acknowledge even to herself, a sense of suffocation, as if the weight of all that history pressed against her chest like a physical burden. "Today we practice the dance of the four directions," announced Hakan, the weapons master whose scarred hands had guided 3 generations of warriors. "Each direction teaches us something different about combat, about life, about the balance that keeps our world stable." The warriors formed a circle, their movements synchronized from years of shared training. East for new beginnings and the element of air, south for growth and the power of fire, west for reflection and the wisdom of water, north for completion and the strength of earth. As they moved through the ancient forms, Aiyana felt her body respond with trained precision, while her mind wandered to forbidden places. The dance spoke of balance, but what happened when the scales could not be made equal? When duty pulled in one direction and something else, something she dared not name, even in her own thoughts, pulled in another. Her movements remained flawless, muscle memory guiding her through steps she had performed thousands of times. But Takoda, dancing opposite her in the circle, seemed to sense her distraction. His painted face showed concern, masked as concentration. The war paint that marked them as warriors also marked them as bound to certain expectations. Each color carried obligations, promises made to ancestors and community. Red for courage in the face of any enemy, yellow for wisdom in making difficult choices, black for the willingness to sacrifice personal desires for the greater good. As the dance concluded, Aiyana caught her reflection in a small pool of water that had collected in a depression between two rocks. Her own face, unmarked by paint this morning, looked strangely naked, vulnerable. The reflection staring back at her seemed to belong to a stranger, someone caught between worlds with no clear path forward. She touched the smooth surface of the water, watching the ripples distort her image into fragments that scattered and reformed like pieces of a broken dream. "You seem distant today," Takoda observed as the other warriors dispersed to their individual training routines. His voice held the careful tone of someone probing a sensitive subject. Aiyana straightened, forcing her expression into the mask of composure she had perfected over years of public scrutiny. As the daughter of a council member and granddaughter of a legendary warrior, she had learned early that others watched her for signs of weakness or uncertainty. "I am thinking about the riders you mentioned seeing," she lied smoothly. "Their presence troubles me." It was not entirely untrue. The approaching outside world did trouble her, but not in the way Takoda would assume. The riders represented change, possibility, a glimpse of something beyond the familiar boundaries of her existence. The feeling this stirred in her was not entirely unwelcome, and that realization disturbed her more than she cared to admit. Takoda nodded, accepting her explanation with the trust of long friendship. "My cousin Nighty was among the scouts who observed them yesterday. He said they seemed to be mapping the territory, marking distances between water sources and high ground. The implications sent a chill through the morning air. Mapping suggested permanent interest, not the casual passage of travelers. It meant plans being made, decisions that would affect her people, whether they participated in those decisions or not." "Did he follow them?" she asked. "For a time, they made camp near Willow Creek, perhaps 3 miles beyond our traditional boundaries. Their equipment suggested they intended to stay for several days." Aiyana felt her pulse quicken, though she told herself it was concern for tribal security. Willow Creek lay along one of her favorite riding paths, a route she often took when she needed solitude to think. The idea that strangers had claimed that space felt like a personal intrusion. "We should inform the council," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew she would not wait for official action. The need to see these interlopers for herself had already taken root, growing stronger with each passing moment. The training session continued around them, but Aiyana's attention had shifted to the eastern horizon, where morning shadows still clung to the ridgeline. Somewhere beyond those rocks, foreign voices spoke in unfamiliar tongues about her homeland, as if it belonged to them. The thought ignited something fierce in her chest, a protective instinct that demanded action. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature began its inexorable rise toward the punishing heat of midday. Most activity in the village would slow during the hottest hours, when even the lizards sought shade among the rocks. It would be the perfect time to investigate the stranger's camp without drawing attention to her absence. The turquoise necklace her grandmother had given her on her 18th naming day felt suddenly heavy against her throat. The stones, mined from sacred places and blessed by generations of medicine women, were supposed to provide protection and clarity of thought. Today they seemed to pulse with their own inner light, as if responding to some approaching significance. Nanolish had told her the necklace carried the wisdom of water, the element that could carve canyons through solid rock with nothing but patience and persistence. Sometimes, the old woman had said, the most powerful force is the one that flows around obstacles rather than trying to break through them. The memory of those words took on new meaning as Aiyana considered her growing restlessness. Perhaps the answer to her unnamed longing lay not in fighting against it, but in understanding where it might lead. "I should return to help my grandmother with the medicine preparations," she told Takoda, offering an excuse that would not invite questions or requests to accompany her. He accepted this with a nod, already turning his attention to a group of younger warriors who needed guidance with their spear work. The easy way he shifted focus stung slightly, though she knew the feeling was unreasonable. Takoda had his own responsibilities, his own path to follow within the structure of their society. As she walked back toward the village center, Aiyana felt the weight of watching eyes, not hostile scrutiny, but the natural attention paid to someone whose actions mattered to the community. Every choice she made reflected not just on herself, but on her family's honor and her grandfather's legacy. The burden of representation had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, when her heart pulled her towards something she could not even fully acknowledge. The familiar comfort of routine carried her through the next hours, like a current she could not resist. She helped Nalnish prepare healing teas for the elderly members of the tribe, ground corn for the evening meal, and mended a tear in one of her father's ceremonial shirts. Each task required concentration, providing temporary refuge from the restless energy that had been building inside her. But as the sun reached its peak and the village settled into the quiet rhythm of midday rest, Aiyana found herself standing at the edge of their settlement, looking east toward the ridgeline that concealed Willow Creek. The paper documents Takoda had mentioned, the treaty negotiations her father attended, represented the formal channels through which their future would be decided. Yet something in her rebelled against waiting for decisions made by others, no matter how well-intentioned. Her horse, Aiyana's most trusted companion, sensed her mood before she had fully acknowledged it herself. The mare's dark eyes held an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human, a connection forged through years of shared adventures and quiet understanding. When Aiyana approached with bridle in hand, the horse stepped forward without hesitation. "Just a short ride," she whispered to the animal, though they both knew that her definition of short often stretched beyond what others might consider reasonable. "We need to see what threatens our peace." The familiar weight of leather reins in her hands and the solid warmth of the horse beneath her brought a sense of rightness that had been missing all morning. Here, in this partnership between human and animal, she found a freedom that existed nowhere else in her carefully structured life. They moved through the canyon with practiced silence, following paths that few others knew. Aiyana had discovered many of these routes during childhood explorations, times when the need for solitude had driven her to seek places where she could think without the constant awareness of others' expectations. The landscape changed gradually as they climbed toward the eastern ridge. The familiar red sandstone gave way to different rock formations, older stone that spoke of deeper time and more ancient stories. Sparse vegetation clung to impossibly thin soil, somehow finding enough moisture and nutrients to survive in this harsh environment. As they crested the ridge, Aiyana caught her first glimpse of the strangers' camp. 3 tents arranged in a neat triangle, horses picketed nearby, and the methodical signs of people who understood how to live temporarily in unfamiliar territory. Smoke from a carefully banked fire rose in a thin line that would be invisible from any great distance. But it was not the efficiency of their camp that caused her breath to catch. It was the sight of one figure moving among the horses with a grace that seemed completely at odds with everything she had expected from these foreign intruders. The person was tall, lean in the way that suggested strength without bulk, moving with the kind of fluid confidence that came from years of working with animals. Dark hair caught the sunlight, and when the figure turned in her direction, she found herself looking into eyes that seemed to hold depths she had never encountered before. Even from this distance, she could sense something that defied easy categorization. This was not the crude invader she had imagined, someone who would trample sacred places without understanding or caring about their significance. This person moved through the landscape with respect, touching nothing unnecessarily, leaving barely a trace of passage. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. This stranger understood the desert the way her own people did, with reverence and attention to the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in this unforgiving country. Their eyes met across the intervening space, and Aiyana felt something shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates finding new alignment. The stranger raised one hand in what might have been greeting or acknowledgement, a gesture that held no threat or challenge. She should leave. Every instinct trained by years of tribal teachings told her to withdraw, to report what she had seen to the proper authorities, to let others decide how to respond to this incursion. Instead, she found herself guiding her horse down the slope toward the camp, drawn by something stronger than caution or common sense. The treaty documents that occupied her father's attention suddenly seemed like distant abstractions compared to this immediate, visceral reality of two people recognizing something unexpected in each other across a divide that was supposed to be unbridgeable. The descent toward the camp felt like crossing an invisible line that could never be uncrossed. Each step her horse took seemed to echo with the sound of something breaking, not violently, but with the quiet finality of a twig snapping under careful pressure. Aiyana's hand moved instinctively to the broken arrow shaft she carried in her medicine pouch, a reminder of the last treaty her people had signed and how quickly such agreements could shatter. As she drew closer, more details became clear. The stranger was a woman, perhaps close to Aiyana's own age, with skin weathered by sun and wind in a way that spoke of a life lived outdoors. Her clothing was practical: leather pants, a cotton shirt, boots designed for riding rather than ceremony. But there was something in her bearing that suggested education, refinement, a background that included more than frontier survival. "You move quietly for someone riding alone in unfamiliar territory," the woman called out when Aiyana was still 30 yards away. Her voice carried clearly in the thin air, accented with something Aiyana could not immediately place. Not Spanish, not the harsh consonants of English, as spoken by most government officials. Something softer, more musical. Aiyana brought her horse to a stop, at what she judged to be a safe distance, close enough for conversation, far enough to escape quickly if necessary. "You camp in places that are not yours to claim," she replied, keeping her own voice level despite the rapid beating of her heart. The stranger smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. What had seemed stern and purposeful from a distance revealed itself as something far more complex. Intelligence, yes, but also warmth and a hint of mischief that Aiyana found unexpectedly appealing. "I claim nothing," the woman said, spreading her hands in a gesture of openness. "I am passing through, like water finding its way around stones. My name is Aiyana Moreau. I am a surveyor, hired to map water sources and mineral deposits for the territorial government." The admission should have triggered immediate alarm. Surveyors meant preparation for settlement, for the kind of permanent changes that would destroy everything Aiyana's people had fought to preserve. Instead, she found herself studying Aiyana's face for signs of the casual disregard she expected from such people. What she saw there confused her. Aiyana's eyes held something that looked almost like regret, as if she understood the implications of her presence and took no pleasure in them. "Your people have every right to be suspicious of my work," Aiyana continued, her tone carefully respectful. "I have seen what happens when governments decide they need land that belongs to others. It is rarely a fair exchange." The unexpected honesty hit Aiyana like a physical blow. She had prepared for hostility, for dismissal, for the kind of blind certainty that allowed people to take what they wanted without acknowledging the cost to others. This acknowledgement of harm, this recognition of her people's rights, left her without a ready response. "Then why do you do this work?" she asked finally. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving across the landscape with something that looked like appreciation rather than calculation. "Because if I do not map these places accurately, someone else will. Someone who might not notice the sacred sites that should be preserved, the water sources that cannot be disturbed without destroying entire ecosystems. Someone who sees only resources to be extracted rather than a living system that has sustained people for generations." The logic was sound, but it carried the bitter taste of compromise that Aiyana had learned to associate with the approach of white civilization. Always there were reasonable explanations for unreasonable outcomes, practical justifications for spiritual destruction. "And you believe your maps will make such destruction less likely?" Aiyana asked, unable to keep skepticism from her voice. "I believe," Aiyana said carefully, "that knowledge can be a form of protection if it falls into the right hands, and I hope to ensure that it does." The conversation was moving into territory that felt dangerous for reasons having nothing to do with tribal security. Aiyana's evident sincerity, her obvious intelligence, the way she looked at the desert with something approaching reverence, all of this conspired to make her seem less like an enemy and more like something Aiyana had no framework for understanding. "Your people have warriors," Aiyana observed, nodding toward the war paint that still decorated Aiyana's horse's bridle. "But you ride alone to investigate strangers. That suggests either great confidence or great foolishness." Perhaps both, Aiyana admitted, surprised by her own honesty. I am called Aiyana. I am daughter of Quixote, granddaughter of Ashki, who counted coup against the cavalry at Salt River. She watched for Elena's reaction to this lineage, this claiming of identity through deeds of resistance. Many whites grew uncomfortable when confronted with the specific history of conflict between their people and hers. Instead, Elena nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. I have heard stories of that battle. Your grandfather was said to be a tactician of remarkable skill. The acknowledgement of her grandfather's reputation should have filled Aiyana with pride. Instead, it created an unexpected ache in her chest. Here was a stranger who spoke of Ashki with more understanding than many of her own generation, who seemed to grasp the tactical brilliance behind battles that had become simplified into mere stories of savage violence in most tellings. You know more of our history than I would have expected, she said, unable to keep surprise from her voice. Elena's expression grew thoughtful. I make it my business to understand the people whose lands I am asked to survey. History provides context that makes the present more comprehensible. Your grandfather's strategies at Salt River showed a deep understanding of terrain and psychology that any military academy would admire. The conversation felt like walking on unstable ground. Each exchange revealed new complexities that challenged Aiyana's assumptions about who this woman might be. Elena spoke with the authority of someone educated in military tactics, yet her manner suggested sympathy for the Apache cause rather than admiration for their enemies. Most of your people prefer simpler stories, Aiyana observed. We are either noble savages living in harmony with nature or bloodthirsty warriors who must be civilized or eliminated. Few care to understand the tactical thinking behind our resistance. Most of my people, Elena agreed with a slight smile, prefer stories that make them feel better about their own actions. Understanding your grandfather's brilliance would require acknowledging that he was defending something worth preserving. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a signal fire, visible from great distances and impossible to ignore. Elena had just acknowledged what few whites would admit, that Apache resistance was not mindless savagery, but a rational response to invasion. Elena felt her horse shift restlessly beneath her, responding to tensions she was trying to keep hidden. The animal's unease reminded her that she was sitting exposed on open ground, having a conversation that could be seen by anyone who happened to look in their direction. Her absence from the village would be noticed soon, if it had not been already. I should return, she said, though the words felt wrong in her mouth. Every instinct told her to stay, to continue this extraordinary conversation with someone who seemed to understand nuances that eluded most outsiders. Of course, Elena replied, but Elena caught a flicker of something that might have been disappointment in her eyes. Your people will worry if you are gone too long. The practical concern was real enough. Takoda would notice her absence first, then others would begin to ask questions. Her father's position on the tribal council meant that her actions reflected on more than just herself. A warrior's daughter, meeting secretly with a government surveyor, would be seen as at best poor judgment, at worst potential betrayal. Yet as she gathered her reins to leave, Elena spoke again. If you would not mind, I would value the chance to speak with someone who understands this land as you do. My maps show elevation and water sources, but they miss the deeper knowledge that comes from generations of living in harmony with a place. The request was reasonable, even practical. A surveyor working with local knowledge would produce more accurate results than one relying solely on instruments and observation. But Aiyana heard something beneath the words, a personal interest that had nothing to do with professional competence. Such conversations could be misunderstood, she said carefully. By your people or mine? Elena asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood the risks from both directions. Aiyana considered the question seriously. Her own people would see any cooperation with a surveyor as potential collaboration with those who sought to take their land. Elena's employers would likely view her consultation with Apache sources as at best an unnecessary complication, at worst a compromise of her loyalty to territorial interests. Both, she admitted. Elena nodded slowly. Then perhaps our conversations should remain private, at least until we understand what form they might take. The suggestion of secrecy should have triggered every warning Aiyana had ever received about the dangers of deception and divided loyalties. Instead, it sent a thrill through her that she recognized as something forbidden and therefore intensely appealing. "I ride this direction often," she found herself saying. "The old trails offer solitude for thinking." "I expect to be in this area for several more days," Aiyana replied. "My work requires detailed observation of seasonal water patterns." They were not quite making an appointment, but neither were they saying goodbye. The careful ambiguity of their words created space for future encounters without the weight of formal commitment. As Aiyana turned her horse toward home, she felt the weight of Aiyana's gaze following her retreat. The sensation was not uncomfortable, but it was definitely not neutral either. The ride back to the village passed in a blur of conflicting thoughts. Aiyana's horse seemed to sense her distraction, picking its way carefully along the familiar paths while she wrestled with emotions she had no names for. The silver cross that Aiyana wore at her throat had caught the sunlight during their conversation, a simple piece of jewelry that somehow represented the vast gulf between their worlds, yet Aiyana had not spoken like someone who viewed that gulf as unbridgeable. Her knowledge of Apache history, her respectful manner, the way she looked at the landscape with appreciation rather than calculation, all of this suggested possibilities that Aiyana had never allowed herself to consider. The village came into view as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, and with it the return of familiar obligations. She could see Takoda near the training ground, working with a group of younger warriors on horseback maneuvers. His painted face turned in her direction as she approached, and she read concern in his expression. "Your grandmother was asking for you," he called out as she dismounted. "There are preparations needed for tonight's council gathering." The words carried subtle emphasis that told her Nalnish's inquiries had not been casual. Her absence had been noted, discussed, perhaps even worried over. The realization brought a flush of guilt that she tried to hide as she led her horse toward the corral. "I was checking the eastern water sources," she replied, offering enough truth to satisfy casual curiosity while omitting the details that would provoke difficult questions. Takoda accepted this explanation with a nod, but she caught the way his eyes lingered on her face, searching for signs of whatever had kept her away longer than a simple reconnaissance would require. They had known each other too long for him to miss the subtle signs of agitation that she was trying to conceal. "Find anything concerning?" he asked. The question was innocent enough, but it forced her to navigate the treacherous ground between honesty and deception. "The strangers' camp is well organized," she said. "They appear to be planning an extended stay." This was truth as far as it went. She was simply leaving out the part about extended conversation with one of those strangers, the part about feeling more engaged and intellectually stimulated than she had in months. "We should organize additional patrols," Takoda suggested. "If they intend to remain in the area, we need to monitor their activities more closely." The practical wisdom of his suggestion was obvious, yet Aiyana felt something like panic at the thought of increased tribal surveillance around Aiyana's camp. The idea of other warriors watching Aiyana, perhaps reporting on her activities or even confronting her, created a protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. "Perhaps," she agreed carefully, "though they seem more interested in mapping than in immediate encroachment. Their presence may be temporary if they complete their surveys quickly." Takoda's expression sharpened slightly at what might have sounded like defending the intruders. "All mapping is preparation for something more permanent," he pointed out. "They do not spend time and resources documenting our territory for idle curiosity." He was right, of course. Aiyana's presence here was part of a larger process that would ultimately threaten everything Aiyana's people valued. The knowledge should have strengthened her resolve to maintain proper distance from someone who represented such danger. Instead, it made her want to understand Aiyana's true motivations, to discover whether there might be ways to influence the outcome of her surveys in directions that would cause less harm to Apache interests. "I should attend to my grandmother," she said, ending the conversation before it could move into territory that would require more deception than she was prepared to offer. Nelnish was waiting inside their dwelling, her weathered hands busy with preparations for the evening meal, but Aiyana could tell from the set of her shoulders that food was not the primary concern occupying the old woman's thoughts. "You were gone longer than usual," Nelnish observed without looking up from the corn she was grinding. The eastern trails must have offered interesting discoveries. The comment carried the weight of deeper knowledge. Nelnish had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when something significant had occurred, even when no obvious evidence supported such intuition. The stranger's camp is located near Willow Creek, Aiyana replied, settling beside her grandmother and taking up a portion of the grinding work. They appear to be surveyors working for the territorial government. And did these surveyors notice your observation of their activities? The question was asked in such a casual tone that it took Aiyana a moment to recognize the trap it represented. Nelnish was not asking whether she had been seen, but whether she had allowed herself to be seen, whether observation had become interaction. One of them did, she admitted, unable to bring herself to lie directly to her grandmother. Nelnish's grinding rhythm never faltered, but Aiyana sensed a shift in her grandmother's attention, a sharpening of focus that meant the conversation had moved beyond casual inquiry into something more significant. And what manner of person was this surveyor? The old woman asked, her voice maintaining its deceptively mild tone. Aiyana felt heat rise in her cheeks, a reaction that would not escape her grandmother's notice. Educated, respectful, not what I expected from someone in such work. Ah, the single syllable carried volumes of meaning. Nelnish set aside her grinding stone and turned to face Aiyana directly, her dark eyes holding the kind of penetrating attention that had always made deception impossible. And did this educated, respectful person offer explanations for their presence in our territory? The questions were drawing Aiyana deeper into territory she was not prepared to navigate. Each honest answer revealed more about the encounter than she intended to share. Yet lying to Nelnish felt like betraying something fundamental about their relationship. She said she was mapping water sources and mineral deposits, but she also spoke of trying to protect sacred sites from those who might not recognize their importance. Nelnish nodded slowly, processing this information with the careful attention she gave to all matters that might affect tribal welfare. So this surveyor is a woman. The observation was stated without particular emphasis, but Aiyana recognized it as significant. Women in Aiyana's profession were rare enough to be noteworthy, suggesting either exceptional ability or unusual circumstances that had led to such work. Yes, her name is Aiyana Moreau. She claims to have studied our history, knew of grandfather's tactics at Salt River. Interesting. Nelnish retrieved her warrior's shield from where it hung on the dwelling's wall, running her fingers over the painted symbols that told the story of her own younger days, when she had fought alongside the men in defending their territory. Knowledge of our ways in an outsider can be either a gift or a weapon, depending on how it is used. The shield bore scratches and scars from actual combat, reminders of a time when the lines between friend and enemy had been drawn more clearly. Each mark represented a moment when Nelnish had chosen duty over safety, tribal loyalty over personal comfort. She seemed genuinely respectful, Aiyana said, aware that she was defending Aiyana, but unable to stop herself. Not like the government officials who speak of civilization while planning our destruction. Respect can be genuine and still serve purposes that bring harm, Nelnish replied gently. A person can admire a flower while picking it for their own garden. The analogy hit closer to home than Aiyana cared to acknowledge. Aiyana's appreciation for Apache culture could coexist with work that ultimately served to diminish it. Good intentions provided no protection against harmful outcomes. What would you counsel? Aiyana asked, seeking guidance while knowing that her grandmother's wisdom would likely conflict with the growing attraction she felt toward continued contact with Aiyana. Nelnish was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from the shield to the small window that looked out toward the eastern ridgeline where Aiyana's camp lay hidden beyond the rocks. I would counsel remembering that shields serve two purposes, she said finally. They protect us from harm, but they also prevent us from reaching beyond ourselves. Sometimes the protection we think we need becomes the barrier that keeps us from understanding what we truly require. The words carried the riddling quality that marked Nelnish's deeper teachings, advice that would reveal its meaning only as circumstances unfolded to provide context. For now, Aiyana could only sense that her grandmother was not offering simple warnings about the dangers of contact with outsiders. Your father returns tonight from the council meeting, Nelnish continued, shifting to more practical matters. There will be news about the treaty negotiations, decisions that may affect how we respond to surveyors and their work. The reminder brought Aiyana back to the larger context surrounding Elena's presence. Whatever personal interest she might feel in continued conversation, the reality was that Aiyana represented forces that threatened everything her people valued. Treaties might provide temporary protection, but history had shown that such agreements lasted only as long as they served the interests of those with greater military power. Yet Elena's words about trying to protect sacred sites suggested someone who might be influenced toward decisions that would benefit Apache interests. The possibility that she could serve as a bridge between worlds, rather than simply an agent of destruction, created opportunities that pure resistance could never achieve. "I will attend tonight's gathering," Aiyana said, though she suspected her mind would be only partially focused on her father's report. Part of her attention would remain fixed on the eastern horizon, wondering what Aiyana was doing in her solitary camp and whether their paths would cross again. The evening council fire cast dancing shadows across the faces of the gathered tribal members, the light painting features in alternating patterns of warm gold and deep darkness. Aiyana sat with the other unmarried adults, close enough to hear every word of her father's report, but far enough from the central circle to avoid drawing attention to her presence. Quixote's face showed the weariness of difficult negotiations as he addressed the assembly. The sacred fire embers glowed between his hands as he spoke, their light seeming to pulse with the rhythm of his words, like a heartbeat made visible. "The territorial government offers new terms," he began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he had learned to maintain when delivering news that could be interpreted in multiple ways. "They acknowledge our right to remain on designated portions of our traditional lands in exchange for our cooperation with certain development activities." A murmur ran through the assembled people, the sound carrying undertones of skepticism born from experience with previous governmental promises. Aiyana felt her stomach tighten as she anticipated what those development activities might include. "They specifically mention mineral surveys and water rights assessments," Quixote continued. "Activities they claim are necessary for the long-term prosperity of the entire territory." The euphemistic language could not disguise what everyone understood. Their cooperation with Elena's work, and others like her, was not a request, but a condition for maintaining any rights to their homeland. The realization sent a chill through Aiyana that had nothing to do with the cooling desert air. How Hakon, the weapons master, spoke from his position among the elder warriors. "And if we refuse this cooperation, what then do they offer?" Quixote's expression grew grimmer. "They speak of relocation to designated areas where our traditional ways can be preserved without interference from development. They describe this as protection for our culture." The bitter irony was not lost on anyone present. Protection that required abandonment of the places that gave their culture meaning was no protection at all. Sacred sites could not be relocated. Ancestral burial grounds could not be moved to more convenient locations. "How long do we have to provide our response?" asked Nalnish, her voice cutting through the general murmur of discontent. 30 days, Quixote replied. They emphasized that this timeline allows for proper consideration while meeting their administrative requirements. Aiyana understood the real message behind the deadline. 30 days was long enough to create the appearance of choice while being short enough to prevent meaningful resistance from being organized. It was the kind of calculated pressure that forced decisions before their full implications could be understood. As the discussion continued around the fire, Aiyana found her thoughts returning to Elena's words about trying to protect sacred sites from those who might not recognize their importance. If the surveyor's work was proceeding whether the tribe cooperated or not, then Elena's expressed intentions might represent the best chance for minimizing the damage. The idea of using her growing connection with Aiyana to influence the survey outcomes took shape in her mind, like smoke-forming patterns in still air. It would require maintaining contact, building trust, perhaps even sharing knowledge that could be seen as betraying tribal interests. Yet if that knowledge led to protection of the most sacred places, if it prevented the worst forms of desecration, might such cooperation actually serve tribal interests better than pure resistance? The internal debate was interrupted by Takoda's voice, speaking from his position among the younger warriors. "What do we know about the surveyors already in our territory? Are they part of this treaty process or separate from it?" Quixote's eyes found Aiyana in the outer circle, and she felt a moment of panic at the possibility that her afternoon's activities had somehow become known to him. but his expression held only the mild attention of someone seeking information. "There are reports of a survey team near Willow Creek," he said. "Standard mapping activities, as far as our scouts have determined. Nothing that suggests immediate threat." The casual dismissal of Aiyana's presence as non-threatening would have been reassuring under other circumstances. Tonight it felt like a dangerous misunderstanding that could lead to missed opportunities or worse complications. "Perhaps someone should make contact," suggested one of the council members. "If cooperation is to be required, we might benefit from understanding their specific intentions." The suggestion hung in the air like an invitation and a challenge. Aiyana felt multiple gazes turn in her direction, not with suspicion, but with the kind of expectant attention paid to someone whose skills and courage made them a natural choice for such a mission. Her father's eyes met hers across the fire, and she read approval there, not for anything she had already done, but for what he clearly expected her to be willing to do in service to tribal interests. The woven blanket that had covered Aiyana since childhood felt heavier than usual as she lay beneath it that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the village settling into sleep. Her mother had created the blanket during the long months of pregnancy, each thread chosen with care and woven with prayers for the child who would one day find comfort beneath its warmth. Tonight, that comfort eluded her. The council's discussion had created possibilities she had not anticipated, legitimate reasons for the contact with Aiyana that her heart already desired. The convergence of duty and inclination should have brought relief, yet it only intensified the conflict that had been building inside her since morning. The approval she had seen in her father's eyes carried expectations that went beyond simple reconnaissance. If she made contact with the survey team, she would be representing not just herself, but her entire people. Every word she spoke, every impression she created, could influence outcomes that would affect generations. The responsibility should have been daunting enough to overwhelm any personal considerations. Instead, it provided a framework that made her growing fascination with Aiyana seem less like betrayal and more like preparation for necessary work. She rose before dawn, moving quietly through the dwelling so as not to wake Naunish. The old woman's breathing remained steady and deep, but Aiyana suspected her grandmother was more aware of her movements than she appeared. Little escaped Naunish's attention, especially when it concerned family members wrestling with significant decisions. The eastern horizon showed the first pale suggestion of approaching sunrise as Aiyana prepared her horse for another journey toward Willow Creek. This time, she would not be sneaking away to indulge unauthorized curiosity. She would be fulfilling a responsibility acknowledged by the tribal council, investigating strangers whose presence could affect the future of her people. The rationalization felt thin, even to herself, but it provided enough justification to quiet the voices of caution that had been whispering warnings since her conversation with Aiyana. The ride through pre-dawn darkness required all her attention, navigation by stars and the subtle variations in air movement that indicated changes in terrain. Her horse moved with the confidence of an animal that trusted its rider's judgment completely, even when that judgment led into uncertain territory. As they climbed toward the ridge overlooking Aiyana's camp, Aiyana caught the scent of wood smoke carrying on the morning breeze. Someone was awake early, tending a fire that suggested preparation for the day's work, rather than the banked embers of a camp, settled for sleep. The sight that greeted her as she crested the ridge stopped her completely. Aiyana stood beside the creek, fully dressed but with her hair unbound, washing her face in water that caught the first rays of sunlight like liquid silver. There was something profoundly peaceful about the scene, a moment of private ritual that seemed to connect Aiyana to the landscape in ways that contradicted everything Aiyana had assumed about outsiders and their relationship to the natural world. Aiyana looked up as if sensing observation, her eyes finding Aiyana immediately despite the distance and the soft light that should have made such recognition difficult. Instead of surprise or alarm, her expression showed something that looked remarkably like welcome. "You return earlier than I expected," Aiyana called softly, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Though perhaps I should have anticipated that someone with your grandfather's tactical instincts would understand the advantages of dawn approaches." The reference to military strategy in the context of what was supposed to be a friendly visit created an undercurrent of meaning that made Aiyana's pulse quicken. Aiyana was acknowledging that this encounter, like their previous one, existed in territory where normal social rules did not quite apply. "My people are concerned about your presence here," Aiyana replied, guiding her horse down the slope toward the creek. "They have asked me to determine your true intentions." It was truth, though not the complete truth. The council had suggested contact, but the timing and manner of that contact remained her own choice. She was here as much from personal desire as from tribal duty. A reasonable concern, Aiyana agreed, moving away from the water's edge to meet her, and one that deserves a more complete answer than I was able to provide yesterday. The admission that their previous conversation had been incomplete intrigued Aiyana more than it should have. Aiyana seemed to be acknowledging layers of complexity that had not been addressed, depths that might explain the sense of connection Aiyana had felt despite the obvious barriers between their worlds. "I have coffee," Aiyana offered, gesturing toward her camp, "and time to explain things that require more than brief conversation to understand properly." The invitation was simple enough, yet accepting it would cross another invisible line. The obsidian knife at Aiyana's belt seemed to pulse with significance as she dismounted, its polished surface reflecting the growing light like a dark mirror. The blade had been her grandfather's, used in ceremonies that marked the transition from one phase of life to another. Now it felt like a physical reminder of the sharp edge between duty and desire on which she balanced. Aiyana's camp revealed details that had been invisible from a distance. Maps spread on a flat rock showed the region in careful detail, but not the sterile documentation Aiyana had expected. Instead, she saw notations in multiple languages, symbols that looked almost like the sacred markings her own people used to indicate places of spiritual significance. "You read Apache symbols," Aiyana observed, studying the maps more closely. "I try to," Aiyana replied, pouring coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm beside the fire. "Though I suspect my understanding is incomplete. Written symbols can only capture so much of what a place means to the people who have lived with it for generations." The admission revealed something important about Aiyana's approach to her work. Most surveyors treated the landscape as a collection of resources to be catalogued and measured. Aiyana seemed to understand that the meaning of places could not be captured by elevation markers and mineral assays alone. "These notations," Aiyana said, pointing to marks on the map that corresponded to areas she recognized as sacred sites. "Where did you learn their significance?" Aiyana hesitated, and Aiyana sensed they were approaching territory that required careful navigation. "From sources that preferred to remain anonymous. People who understood that knowledge shared with someone who respects its importance might lead to better protection than silence that allows destruction through ignorance." The implication was clear. Aiyana had allies among native peoples, individuals who trusted her enough to share information that was normally kept within tribal boundaries. The knowledge should have alarmed Aiyana, evidence of dangerous precedents for the kind of cooperation she was contemplating. Instead, it suggested that others had wrestled with similar conflicts between tribal loyalty and the practical need to work with outsiders who might influence outcomes in positive directions. She was not the first to walk this difficult path. "And your employers?" she asked. "Do they share your respect for such places?" Aiyana's laugh held no humor. "My employers care about mineral deposits and water rights. They hired me because they need accurate maps, not because they value cultural sensitivity, but accurate maps prepared by someone who understands the full significance of what they document might serve purposes beyond simple resource extraction." The careful phrasing revealed the complexity of Aiyana's position. She was walking her own version of the line between duty and conscience, using her position to serve goals that her employers might not approve if they understood them completely. "You risk much by sharing this with me," Aiyana observed. "Less than you risk by being here," Aiyana replied, meeting her eyes directly. "My reputation might suffer if my methods become known. Your safety could be threatened if your people discover you have been sharing coffee with a government surveyor." The acknowledgement of mutual risk created a sense of partnership that went beyond their previous careful conversations. They were both operating outside the boundaries of what their respective communities would consider appropriate, driven by beliefs that transcended simple tribal loyalties. "Tell me about the treaty negotiations," Aiyana said, settling on a flat rock with her coffee cup cradled in both hands. "The information I receive through official channels lacks the kind of context that would help me understand what my work might actually contribute to." The request for inside information should have triggered every warning Aiyana had ever received about the dangers of sharing tribal business with outsiders. Instead, she found herself considering what Aiyana might do with such knowledge and how it might influence the outcomes that would affect her people. 30 days, she said finally. We have 30 days to agree to cooperate with surveys and development activities or face relocation to designated areas. Aiyana's expression darkened. Relocation, the government solution for inconvenient populations. Remove them from places that have meaning and expect them to be grateful for the privilege of survival. The bitterness in her voice suggested personal experience with such policies, though Aiyana could not imagine what might have given a white woman insight into the effects of forced displacement. You speak as if you understand what such relocation means, Aiyana said. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee, as if the dark liquid might reveal answers to questions she was reluctant to ask. My grandmother was Cherokee, she said finally. She survived the removal to Oklahoma, though many of her family did not. I grew up hearing stories about what it means to lose the places that define who you are. The revelation hit Aiyana like a physical blow. Aiyana's words hung in the morning air like smoke that refused to dissipate, reshaping everything Aiyana thought she understood about the woman sitting across from her. The hidden letter Aiyana pulled from her pack seemed to glow with significance in the growing daylight, its edges worn from careful handling over many years. This was written by my grandmother to my mother, Aiyana said, unfolding the paper with reverence. She kept it hidden for decades, afraid that Cherokee heritage would make life even more difficult for her descendants. Aiyana leaned forward as Aiyana translated the faded writing, her voice carrying the weight of inherited pain. The letter described the removal, the deaths along the trail, the way entire communities had been scattered like seeds on barren ground. But more than that, it spoke of a promise made by a dying woman to a young granddaughter she would never see. She made my mother swear that if the opportunity ever arose, our family would use whatever advantages we possessed to protect other native peoples from suffering the same losses. Aiyana continued. My education, my position with the territorial government, these were not chosen for personal advancement, but to honor that promise. The revelation struck Aiyana with the force of a lightning bolt, illuminating a darkened landscape. Aiyana was not simply a sympathetic outsider, but someone whose own blood carried the memory of loss and displacement. Her work as a surveyor was not betrayal of indigenous interests, but a form of resistance conducted from within the structures of power. You could have told me this yesterday, Aiyana said, though she understood why such information had been withheld. Trust was not built in single conversations, especially when the stakes were so high. Yesterday, I did not know if you were someone who could understand the complexity of serving one purpose while appearing to serve another, Aiyana replied. Today, watching you struggle with your own divided loyalties, I recognize a kindred spirit. The phrase kindred spirit created a flutter in Aiyana's chest that had nothing to do with matters of ancestry or political alliance. There was something in Aiyana's tone, in the way her eyes lingered on Aiyana's face, that suggested connections deeper than shared political purposes. What exactly are you proposing? Aiyana asked, needing to focus on practical matters before the conversation moved into territory that would make rational thought impossible. Aiyana spread her maps more widely, pointing to areas marked with the symbols Aiyana had noticed earlier. Your people have 30 days to make an official decision about cooperation, but the surveys will continue regardless because the territorial government considers this a matter of administrative necessity rather than tribal consent. The brutal honesty was appreciated even as it confirmed Aiyana's worst fears about their situation. The illusion of choice was exactly that. An illusion designed to make forced compliance seem voluntary. However, Aiyana continued, the recommendations I include in my reports will influence how those survey results are interpreted and implemented. Sacred sites that I identify as having geological instability, for instance, are unlikely to be targeted for mining operations. Water sources that I describe as seasonal or unreliable will not be diverted for agricultural development. The implications were staggering. Aiyana was offering to use her position to sabotage development plans that would harm Apache interests, disguising protection as technical assessment in ways that would be difficult for her employers to challenge. And the price for such favorable interpretations? Aiyana asked, suspecting that no such assistance came without cost. Knowledge, Aiyana said simply. Information about which sites are truly sacred, which water sources are most critical to tribal survival, which areas could be sacrificed if necessary to protect more important places. The kind of strategic intelligence that would allow me to construct reports that serve your interests while appearing to serve theirs. It was a bargain with the potential to save much of what mattered most to Aiyana's people. It was also a form of collaboration that could be seen as treachery if discovered, putting both women at risk from their respective communities. I need time to consider this, Aiyana said, though she already knew her answer. The opportunity to influence outcomes from within the system was too valuable to reject, regardless of personal risks. Of course, but time is limited, and the surveys proceed whether we act or not. Aiyana began folding her maps, preparing to return to the work that provided cover for these conversations. I will be here for the next week, gathering baseline measurements that will form the foundation for all subsequent reports. As Aiyana prepared to leave, Aiyana caught her hand in a gesture that felt simultaneously natural and shocking. The contact sent electricity through her entire body, a physical confirmation of attractions she had been trying to deny. "Be careful," Aiyana said softly. "I suspect we are both walking paths that lead to places neither of our peoples would approve." The warning came too late. Aiyana was already far beyond the point where careful consideration might have led to different choices. The war drum's steady rhythm echoed across the village that evening, its deep voice calling the people to gather for a ceremony that had not been held in over 2 years. Aiyana felt each beat resonate in her chest like a second heartbeat, one that seemed to pulse in time with thoughts of Aiyana and the impossible choice that lay before her. She had spent the afternoon in careful preparation, gathering information about sacred sites in a way that would not attract attention to her activities. The process required visiting with various tribal elders, ostensibly seeking their wisdom about traditional practices, but actually creating a mental map of the places that mattered most to her people's spiritual survival. Each conversation had been a delicate balance between casual inquiry and purposeful intelligence gathering. Too much interest in specific locations would raise questions she was not prepared to answer. Too little would leave her without the knowledge Aiyana needed to construct protective deceptions in her reports. Nerdilnish watched her granddaughter's activities with the knowing eyes of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the signs of a person wrestling with momentous decisions. As they prepared for the evening ceremony, she spoke in the indirect way that allowed important truths to be conveyed without forcing direct confrontation. "The drum calls us to remember who we are," she said, helping Aiyana arrange her ceremonial clothing. "But sometimes remembering requires us to choose which parts of ourselves to honor most deeply." The comment could have referred to the general crisis facing their people, the choice between resistance and accommodation that the treaty deadline forced upon them. But Aiyana heard deeper layers in her grandmother's words, an acknowledgement that personal choices sometimes carried consequences as significant as political ones. "And if the parts of ourselves pull in different directions?" Aiyana asked, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability with the woman who had guided her through every previous crisis of conscience. "Then we must trust that the strongest part contains the wisdom to guide us toward right action," Nalnish replied. "Though sometimes what feels strongest in the moment is not what proves truest over time." The distinction between strength and truth resonated in ways that made Aiyana uncomfortable. Her attraction to Aiyana felt powerful, undeniable, but was it also true in the deeper sense that would survive the pressures of reality? Or was it simply the appeal of forbidden territory, made more attractive by its very impossibility? As they walked toward the central fire, where the ceremony would take place, Aiyana caught sight of Takoda, preparing his own ceremonial dress. The war paint he applied to his face tonight was different from his usual patterns, more complex designs that marked him as someone seeking spiritual guidance for difficult decisions. Their eyes met across the gathering crowd, and she saw her own conflicts reflected in his expression. He, too, was struggling with choices that would define not just his own future, but his relationship to the community that had shaped his identity since birth. The drum's rhythm intensified as the formal ceremony began, joined by other instruments that created layers of sound meant to open pathways between the human world and the realm of spiritual guidance. Amaja found herself moving to the ancient rhythms without conscious thought, her body responding to patterns coded into her bones by generations of ancestors who had danced these same steps. But tonight, the familiar movements felt different. Instead of connecting her more deeply to tribal identity, they seemed to highlight the ways in which she was becoming separate from the community that surrounded her. Each step carried her further from the person she had been that morning, closer to someone whose loyalties were divided in ways that traditional ceremonies could not heal. The medicine man's voice rose above the drumbeat, speaking words in the old language that called upon ancestral spirits to provide guidance for their descendants' difficult choices. He asked for wisdom to distinguish between sacrifice that served the greater good and sacrifice that simply served others' interests. The prayer should have brought clarity, direction toward choices that honored both personal integrity and tribal responsibility. Instead, it deepened Aiyana's sense of standing at a crossroads, where every path led away from the certainty she had known as a child. As the ceremony reached its climax, she felt the weight of watching eyes. Not hostile observation, but the natural attention paid to someone whose decisions would affect others. Her father's expression showed pride mixed with concern, recognition that his daughter faced challenges that would test everything he had taught her about honor and duty. The drum's final beat echoed into silence, leaving the assembled people in the hushed space that always followed such ceremonies. In that quiet, Aiyana made her decision. The eagle's flight path map that Aiyana had sketched during their morning conversation lay hidden beneath Aiyana's sleeping furs, its lines tracing routes that existed nowhere in official territorial surveys. The map showed the high places where eagles nested, the thermal currents they rode, the seasonal patterns that governed their movements across the landscape. But more than that, it revealed Aiyana's understanding that true navigation required seeing the world from perspectives beyond human limitations. 3 days had passed since the ceremony, 3 days of careful preparation disguised as normal activities. Aiyana had memorized the locations of every sacred site within a day's ride of the village, catalogued the water sources that could not be compromised without destroying entire ecosystems, identified the places where concessions might be made to protect more critical areas. The information felt like carrying fire in her bare hands, dangerous to hold, potentially catastrophic to drop, but essential for the survival of everything she valued most. Dawn approached with the clarity that only came to the desert after winter storms had washed the air clean of dust and uncertainty. Aiyana rose before the village stirred, moving through her preparations with the focused attention of someone about to undertake a mission that could not be repeated or undone. She chose her clothing carefully, traditional enough to honor her identity, practical enough for hard travel, unremarkable enough to avoid drawing questions about her destination. The eagle feather that had belonged to her grandfather went into her medicine pouch alongside the obsidian knife and a small piece of turquoise that her grandmother had pressed into her palm the night before. For clarity of vision, Nalnish had whispered, her eyes holding knowledge that went beyond what words could express. And for protection when vision leads to dangerous places. The old woman's blessing felt like armor against the doubts that had plagued Aiyana's sleep, though she knew that spiritual protection could not shield her from the practical consequences of the choice she was making. Takoda was waiting beside the horse corral when she emerged, his presence not entirely surprising, but still unwelcome given what she planned to accomplish that day. His painted face showed none of the easy friendship that had characterized their relationship since childhood. Instead, she saw the careful attention of a warrior who suspected his comrade of actions that required investigation. "You ride early again," he observed, the neutral tone not quite concealing deeper concerns. "The eastern boundaries require regular checking," she replied, offering truth that concealed more than it revealed. "With surveyors in the area, we cannot afford to become careless about what happens beyond our immediate territory." Takoda nodded as if accepting her explanation, but she caught the way his eyes lingered on her face, searching for signs of whatever truth she was not sharing. They had known each other too long for simple deception to succeed indefinitely. "Perhaps I should accompany you," he suggested. 2 sets of eyes notice more than one, and the presence of government agents makes solo reconnaissance more dangerous than usual. The offer was reasonable, even wise from a military perspective. It was also impossible to accept without revealing the true nature of her morning's mission, and Aiyana felt the weight of accumulated deceptions pressing against her chest like a physical burden. "Your responsibilities lie elsewhere today," she said, gesturing toward the training ground where younger warriors were already assembling for morning exercises. "The next generation needs guidance more than I need protection." It was a deflection that used Takoda's sense of duty to prevent him from insisting on accompaniment, but the manipulation left a bitter taste in her mouth. Their friendship deserved better than careful maneuvering around uncomfortable truths. "Be careful," he said finally, and she heard layers of meaning in the simple words. Be careful of physical dangers, certainly, but also of choices that could not be undone once made. "Always," she promised, though they both knew that someone who was truly careful would not be riding alone into territory where compromise waited like a snare hidden among familiar paths. The ride to Aiyana's camp passed in a blur of internal preparation, final rehearsals of the information she would share and the boundaries she would not cross. But as Willow Creek came into view, Aiyana realized that all her careful planning had failed to account for the one variable that mattered most: how she would maintain emotional distance from someone whose presence made rational thought increasingly difficult. Aiyana stood beside the water, fully dressed but with her hair loose around her shoulders, watching the sunrise with an expression of such profound appreciation that Aiyana felt her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble before a single word was spoken. The ceremonial headdress that had belonged to Aiyana's grandfather seemed to whisper from its place of honor in her family's dwelling, calling her to remember the weight of leadership and the courage required to make choices that would define entire generations. As she dismounted near Aiyana's camp, she felt that ancestral presence like a guiding hand on her shoulder, steadying her for what was to come. "I wondered if you would return," Aiyana said, turning from her contemplation of the sunrise. "After 3 days, I began to think that wisdom had prevailed over whatever draws you here." The honesty in Aiyana's voice cut through Aiyana's carefully prepared speeches, reducing complex political calculations to the simple truth that she was here because some force stronger than duty or caution compelled her presence. The admission should have been embarrassing, a confession of weakness that undermined her position in any negotiation. Instead, it felt like relief. "Wisdom and I have never been close companions," Aiyana replied, settling beside Aiyana on the flat rock that had become their informal meeting place. "My grandfather used to say that wisdom comes from surviving your own foolishness long enough to learn from it." Aiyana's laugh carried genuine warmth. "A philosophy I understand well. Most of the important decisions in my life have appeared foolish to outside observers. The shared acknowledgement of their mutual impracticality created a bubble of intimacy around them that excluded the larger world with its competing loyalties and irreconcilable demands. For this moment, they were simply two people who had found unexpected connection across the divisions that were supposed to keep them apart. "I have the information you requested," Aiyana said, forcing herself to return to the practical matters that provided justification for these encounters. "But sharing it means crossing a line that cannot be uncrossed." Ella nodded, her expression growing serious. "I understand. Once you give me this knowledge, you become complicit in whatever I do with it. If my reports succeed in protecting your sacred sites, you will have contributed to that protection. If they fail, you will share responsibility for that failure." The brutal clarity of the choice was both terrifying and liberating. Aiyana had spent days wrestling with abstract concepts of loyalty and betrayal, but Aiyana's words reduced the decision to its essential elements. Either she trusted Aiyana enough to risk everything on her good intentions, or she did not. "There is something else," Aiyana continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something that makes this choice more complicated than simple political calculation." Aiyana's eyes searched Aiyana's face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I know," Aiyana said softly. "I feel it too." The acknowledgement hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible gulf. Neither had spoken directly about the attraction that had been building with each encounter, the way their conversations lingered longer than necessary, the careful attention each paid to the other's expressions and gestures. "My people would see it as the ultimate betrayal," Aiyana said, needing to voice the reality they both understood. "Sharing military intelligence with an enemy is one thing, but this—" She gestured between them, encompassing emotions she could barely acknowledge even to herself. This would be seen as complete abandonment of everything that defines who I am. Aiyana reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing against Aiyana's hand in a contact that sent electricity through her entire body. And my people would see it as evidence that I have been compromised, that my reports cannot be trusted because my judgment has been clouded by inappropriate attachments. The word inappropriate should have stung, a reminder of the impossible nature of whatever was developing between them. Instead, it felt like honesty that honored the magnitude of what they were risking by acknowledging these feelings. So we both face ruin if this becomes known, Aiyana observed. Complete ruin, Aiyana agreed. Loss of position, reputation, probably safety as well. Neither of our communities is known for tolerating such boundary crossings. The catalogue of potential consequences should have been sobering enough to restore rational thinking. Instead, it only intensified the sense that they were balanced on the edge of something that would define the rest of their lives, regardless of which direction they chose. And yet, Aiyana continued, her hand still resting against Aiyana's. I find myself caring less about those consequences with each moment we spend together. The confession shattered Aiyana's remaining defenses. In that instant, the choice she had come here to make became inevitable. The two-sided mirror that Aiyana pulled from her pack seemed to capture both women's reflections simultaneously, showing them side by side despite the physical distance that separated their seated positions. One surface reflected Aiyana's traditional features and clothing, the other showed Aiyana's mixed heritage and frontier practicality. Together, they created an image that should have been impossible, two worlds finding harmony where none should exist. My grandmother's mirror, Aiyana explained, turning the artifact so that light played across both reflective surfaces. She said it helped her see clearly when she had to choose between being Cherokee and being safe, between honoring her heritage and protecting her family. Aiyana studied her own reflection, seeing someone she barely recognized. The woman looking back at her had eyes bright with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider, lips curved in an expression of anticipation rather than duty. This was not the face of a tribal warrior bound by ancient codes, but of someone discovering that identity could be more fluid than she had ever imagined. What did she choose? Aiyana asked. Both, Aiyana replied simply. She found ways to honor her Cherokee identity while protecting her descendants from persecution. It required creativity, compromise, and a willingness to appear to be something she was not. But it allowed her to preserve what mattered most while adapting to circumstances beyond her control. The parallel to their current situation was unmistakable. They too faced choices that seemed to require abandoning essential parts of themselves, sacrificing either duty or desire on the altar of impossible circumstances. But perhaps impossibility was simply a failure of imagination. Aiyana began to speak, sharing the sacred knowledge she had gathered with an urgency that surprised them both. She described water sources that fed underground rivers, places where the earth itself would be wounded by mining operations. She mapped ceremonial sites where ancestors slept, areas where disturbance would sever connections that had sustained her people for generations. Aiyana listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that she was being entrusted with more than geographic information. Each revelation carried spiritual weight, cultural significance that transformed her technical maps into something approaching sacred documents. The spring at Red Rock Canyon, Aiyana continued, pointing to a location on Aiyana's map. It appears seasonal from surface observation, but it feeds from deep aquifers that have never failed. If that water is diverted, 3 villages downstream will have no reliable source during drought years. Aiyana made careful notations, using symbols that would appear technical to casual observers, while actually encoding the spiritual and practical significance of each site. Her reports would read like standard geological surveys, while functioning as protective shields around the places that mattered most to Apache survival. As the morning progressed, their collaboration evolved into something more intimate than simple information sharing. Aiyana asked questions that revealed genuine curiosity about Apache culture, while Aiyana found herself describing traditions and beliefs she had never explained to an outsider. "Your grandfather's tactical thinking," Aiyana said during a pause in their work. "It reminds me of something my Cherokee grandmother described. The ability to see multiple possibilities simultaneously, to find paths that others cannot imagine. The comparison struck Aiyana as more than casual observation. Aiyana was suggesting that the qualities that made someone an effective warrior might also make them capable of navigating the complex terrain of divided loyalties and impossible choices. Perhaps, Aiyana continued, what looks like betrayal to others is actually a form of warfare they do not understand. Fighting for your people's survival using weapons and strategies that honor the essence of who they are, even if the methods appear to violate traditional codes. The reframing was seductive, offering a way to see her growing attraction to Aiyana, not as abandonment of tribal identity, but as evolution of it. A warrior's adaptation to new forms of conflict that required new approaches to victory. Yet even as she embraced this perspective, Aiyana remained aware of the voices that would never accept such reasoning. Tekoda's painted face haunted her thoughts, along with her father's expectations and the weight of ancestral approval that had guided her choices since childhood. The sound of approaching horses shattered their intimate bubble, forcing both women to spring apart and assume the positions of casual acquaintances, rather than conspirators in the reshaping of two worlds. Tekoda emerged from behind a stand of cottonwood trees, his war paint fresh and his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. The new dawn that painted the eastern horizon 3 weeks later carried with it the scent of change that had been building since that moment when Tekoda's arrival had forced Aiyana to make the most important choice of her life. As she stood on the ridge overlooking both her village and the distant place where Aiyana's camp had been, she reflected on how completely her world had transformed. That confrontation beside Willow Creek had stripped away all pretense, forcing her to declare openly what her heart had been whispering for days. When Tekoda demanded explanations, when his painted face showed the shock of someone witnessing what he perceived as ultimate betrayal, Aiyana had found words she never knew she possessed. "This is not abandonment," she had told him, her voice carrying the certainty that comes only from deep truth. "This is expansion. My love for our people has not diminished. It has grown large enough to include someone who shares our struggles from a different perspective." Aiyana's presence had provided strength for that declaration, her steady support making it possible to speak truths that would have been impossible to voice alone. Together, they had weathered Tekoda's initial anger, his accusations, his threats to report their collaboration to the tribal council. But gradually, as Aiyana shared her own heritage and the reports she had already submitted, documents that protected every sacred site Aiyana had identified while appearing to serve territorial interests, something had shifted in his understanding. The three of them had spent hours beside that creek, mapping out strategies that none of them could have conceived individually. Tekoda's military mind, Aiyana's cultural knowledge, and Aiyana's position within the government structure had combined to create possibilities that transcended the limitations each faced alone. Now, as she watched the sunrise paint familiar landmarks in shades of gold and copper, Aiyana could see the fruits of their unlikely partnership. Aiyana's reports had successfully diverted mining operations away from the most sacred sites, while identifying alternative locations that would satisfy territorial development goals without devastating Apache spiritual life. More importantly, the relationship that had begun as forbidden attraction had evolved into something that strengthened rather than weakened her connection to tribal identity. Aiyana's respect for Apache traditions, her genuine desire to learn and understand, had deepened Aiyana's own appreciation for the wisdom her ancestors had preserved. The village below was stirring to life, smoke rising from cooking fires and children's voices beginning their eternal chorus of play and discovery. But there were changes here too, subtle shifts that spoke of a community adapting to new realities without abandoning core values. Her father's position on the tribal council had been strengthened by his daughter's success in negotiating protections that no one had thought possible. The treaty that had finally been signed provided more favorable terms than anyone had dared hope, largely because Aiyana's influence had shaped the technical assessments that guided governmental decision-making. Tekoda had found his own path through the complexities they had navigated together, becoming an advocate for strategic cooperation that honored traditional values while adapting to contemporary realities. His painted face now carried new patterns that told the story of a warrior who had learned that victory sometimes required embracing apparent contradictions. Even Nalnish had found ways to incorporate Aiyana into her understanding of how the world should work. Some gifts come wrapped in packages we do not expect, the old woman had observed after meeting Aiyana properly. The spirits often send assistance in forms that test our ability to recognize wisdom when it arrives. As if summoned by her thoughts, Aiyana appeared on the horizon, riding toward their agreed meeting place with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in Alt's landscape. 6 months of regular presence had taught her to move through the desert with respect and understanding, reading the subtle signs that meant the difference between safe passage and dangerous miscalculation. Their relationship had found rhythms that honored both their professional responsibilities and their personal connection. Aiyana continued her surveying work, but now with guidance that ensured her reports served multiple purposes. Aiyana maintained her role as a tribal warrior, but with expanded understanding of how to protect her people in a changing world. The sunrise reached full glory as they met beside the ancient rock formation that had become their special place, a location where the boundaries between worlds seemed more permeable than elsewhere. Here, surrounded by stone that had witnessed the passage of countless generations, they had learned to build something new from the foundations of what had come before. Ready for another day of changing the world? Aiyana asked, her smile carrying the warmth that had become Aiyana's anchor in a reality that continued to evolve in unexpected directions. Always, Aiyana replied, knowing that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together, two hearts that had found a way to honor both love and duty in a world that insisted such combinations were impossible.